Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch and was able to catch up with friends and colleagues. Curator Williams, I'll now turn it over to you to introduce the strategic theme discussion for today's meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We open our strategic theme discussion with a focus on fundamental aspects of our role as a governing board, how we delegate authority to our leaders and others to carry out the duties and the day-to-day business of our 4 universities. The scope of the powers we delegate to the president, the chancellors, and ultimately to those they employ to operate our university is a choice of the board as expressed through the collective rules and regulations. This structure and related expectations are important to us to revisit on a fairly regular basis, particularly as we welcome new curators to the board and as we make up our university community. We're going to skip that sentence. We hope through the discussion we can sharpen understanding among all of us as we welcome, as well as our university communities. Clarity of our shared expectations is important as we fulfill our roles for the benefit of our institutions. I'd like to welcome General Counsel Steve Owens, and he's going to do kind of a high-level outlet of the current structure of delegation and authority, delegation of authority, and then we're going to have Senior Vice President Ryan Rapp, who will provide us some additional detail. Steve.
Thank you, Curator Williams, and thank you for the opportunity to present immediately after lunch. So as a prelude to your all's discussion, I've been asked to discuss the laws and university rules relating to delegations of authority. And in this presentation, I intend to identify the relevant rules and attempt to explain them. I do not intend to express legal opinions on how these rules might apply to particular fact situations. And I do not intend to express policy opinions on whether the rules create good policy or bad policy. That is for your discussion later. Some of this is rather text-heavy, and so you may have a hard time seeing some of it on the screen. We provided handouts of the slides as well as handouts of some of the rules and some of the laws, so they may be easier to read, but they should be at your seat. Well, let's begin with what is delegation of authority. And there's a number of textbook definitions, and they include delegation of authority is part of an organization's design or structure. It refers to the division of authority and powers downwards to the subordinate. When authority is delegated, the party delegating it does not lose the authority delegated. It simply agrees to share it. Delegation of authority is about entrusting someone else or some other level of the organization to do parts of the delegator's job. That may involve making decisions, it may involve taking actions, or both. When something is delegated, 3 core elements are involved: authority, responsibility, and accountability. Well, why does an organization delegate authority? And there's lots of good reasons that probably immediately come to mind, but among them are to take advantage of expertise and specialization of others within the organization, to coordinate decision-making with action-taking, to include those who are most affected by the decision, to minimize the workload on decision-makers. The governing board and the CEO can't be everywhere. And sometimes it's the only practical way to get things done, especially in large organizations. But regardless of the particular reason to delegate, the goal is to make the organization more efficient and more effective in making decisions and taking actions. So let's look at the laws and the rules on delegation of authority involving the university. And we begin with the Board of Curators. So the Board of Curators is granted authority to govern the university by the Missouri Constitution. The full text of that provision is set out on page 1 of your handout. The pertinent part reads, "The government of the state university," which is us, "shall be vested in a Board of Curators." Now, that provision was first placed in the Constitution in 1875. The purpose of it was to give the board broad powers and to insulate it as much as possible from extraneous influences, also that the board's decision-making could be as merit-based as possible. The provision was retained and unchanged in the next Constitution in 1945, which is our current Constitution. Both provisions, the 1875 provision and the 1945 provision, were passed by a vote of Missouri citizens. This board is one of only about 16 university governing boards in the country which has been granted power directly from a state constitution. So if that wasn't enough, the board also has the authority to govern the university pursuant to state statute. RSMO 172.010 states in pertinent part that the government of the university shall be vested in the Board of Curators. This provision is also set out on page 1 of your handout, and it's been part of the Missouri statute since at least 1909. And finally, our own rules, our collected rules, the CRRs, reference the board's authority to govern. So for example, in 10.030B1, it states that pursuant to the Constitution and revised statutes of the state of Missouri, the governance of the university is ultimately vested in the Board of Curators. So the Board of Curators has authority to govern the university pursuant to the Constitution, the state statutes, as well as its own rules. What does it do with that authority? Well, the board delegates some of it to others. If there was any question about whether it could delegate it, it's clear and expressed in the Missouri statutes. In 172.100, it states in pertinent part that the board may delegate so much of its authority as it may deem necessary. And that the complete provision of that statute is on page 1 of your handout. If it wasn't expressed in the statutes, it's probably inherent. The board probably has the inherent authority to delegate some of its authority. So the board does do that, and it makes broad delegations primarily in two places. One is a broad delegation of the board's authority to its executive committee. So CRR 10.030.C.4 sets out that delegation to the board's executive committee. That's on page 2 of your handouts. And it says in pertinent part that the executive committee, when the board is not in session, shall have the powers of the board to take such action as the executive committee may deem to be in the best interest of the university. The board also makes a broad delegation of authority to the president, and that's set forth in section 20.020 of the collected rules, which is also in your handouts. And it states in pertinent part that the president is hereby delegated the general power to act for and on behalf of the Board of Curators and the curators of the University of Missouri. So the board makes these broad delegations of authority to its executive committee and the president, but it also reserves that authority exclusively to itself by making both general reservations of authority and specific ones. So on the screen is listed some of the general reservations of authority. If you look at the grant of authority to the executive committee, you will also find limited language. So for example, in section 10.030C4, which is on page 2 of your handout, it states the executive committee shall have the powers of the board, provided, however, that such action shall be in accord with the provisions of these bylaws and not in conflict with the standing rules and regulations of the board. So while the executive committee can act, it cannot act in a manner that is contrary to existing bylaws or rules. That's one of the reservations of authority by the board. Additionally, any action by the executive committee is subject to review by the full board. That same section of the CRR states that actions of the executive committee may be ratified, approved, or modified at the next regular meeting of the board. If, at the next regular meeting, the board takes no action on the executive committee action, such action shall be deemed ratified. So again, while the executive committee can do certain things within the parameters given to it, it's subject to review by the full board, another reservation of authority. Also, with regard to the president is granted authority pursuant to 20.020A1, and it states the president is hereby delegated the general power to act for and on behalf of the Board of Curators and the university, subject to the bylaws, board rules, and specific instructions from the board. So while the president is granted general authority, he has to act within the confines of the bylaws, of the rules, as well as any instructions coming from the board. These are the general reservations of authority by the board. And if there was any doubt about the reservation of authority, it's cleared up in 20.030, page 4 of your handouts, in which it says the board has the authority to change any decision at any time. So in typical delegations of authority, there is a thought at least that governing boards have the inherent authority to change decisions because all the authority below it is delegated, and so it can pull some back or change a decision. We make that very express in 20.020. The board has the right to change a decision at any time. So those are kind of the three areas of general reservations of your delegation of authority, both to the president and the executive committee. The board also has specific reservations of authority. So sprinkled throughout the CRRs in about 40 different places are certain items that require the board's approval. The board, in other words, the board reserves exclusively to itself the authority to approve certain things. Examples, as you might expect, are fairly significant actions in which the board says only the board can approve these things. And they include things like significant financial or real estate transactions, debt financing. The board's not going to let anybody else approve debt financing. Approval of the president's executive level appointments, the vice presidents and the chancellors. Creation of new academic programs. That's exhibited by what you did today. You all approved 3 new academic programs. Only you can do that. No one else can. And the amount of tuition is another example of a specific area where you approve it. But there's about 40 specific reservations of authority by the board throughout the CRRs. Well, let's look at the delegations of authority to the president and what the president can do with the authority delegated to him. The president is delegated that general authority, subject to some reservations. And then the president may delegate the authority granted by the board. He has the express authority to delegate his authority to others, and that's set out in 20.020B1, page 3 of your handout. That states that the president may delegate his or her authority to such other officers and employees of the university as he may designate. That delegation may be general or specific, very similar to the board's, and he or she retains the right to revoke such delegation at any time. Also very similar to the board's authority, as well as the reservation of authority. Some of the examples of the authority that the president delegates through the CRRs, again, he delegates general authority to the chancellors to be the chief executive and chief academic officers of their campuses. There's some specific delegations. For example, there's one to the chancellors regarding intercollegiate athletics. That's 270.060, which states that the president, consistent with the authority granted to him, hereby delegates overall responsibility for intercollegiate athletic programs to the chancellor of each campus. The delegation is subject to the requirements, mandates, and conditions of that executive order and will be carried out in conformance with Board of Curators policies, rules, and regulations. This delegation does not relieve each respective chancellor of responsibility for keeping the president advised of major issues affecting intercollegiate athletics, including those that have a potential to engender a high degree of public interest. So there, sure.
Interrupt you here. I'm trying to understand. So let's just take an example that a chancellor delegates authority to the athletic director. So I'm going to pick on University of Missouri Columbia campus. Jim Stark does something that 4 or 5 of us don't like, or 1 or 2 of us don't like, or one of us doesn't like, and we talk to the rest of the board members, and they concur, we don't like it. Now, we have not delegated directly that authority to Jim Stark, but we've done it through the president, who did it, in this case himself, to the chancellor, who did it to Jim. If we want to change that decision, does it have to go back through that same, do I have to convince the president of the university, to convince the chancellor of the school, to convince the athletic department to change all that? Or can we just go right to Jim Stark and say, no?
Yeah.
Did I word that very well?
I think I know what you're asking, so I'm going to give you the answer I give to, I've probably given it to you at some point, but the short answer is, if the question is whether the board can do something, whether it has the authority to do something, the answer is almost always yes.
Okay.
The more pertinent question is whether the board should do something.
Mm-hmm.
So just because you can doesn't mean you should. So there would be an operating procedure, I think, if you had some issues with an athletic director, that you probably should work your way down the chain, but you don't have to. You have the legal authority to do just about anything within the confines of the university. Once you get outside the university, you're going to be bound by constitutional provisions, statutes, and your own rules. But once within the university, you have the legal authority to do almost anything.
Thank you.
So those were some examples of one other example of a delegation I want to point out to you, to the chancellors from the president, and that is that the president delegates to the chancellors responsibility for student health matters, and particularly for the development of appropriate immunization policies, and that's set out in 280.025. So that was obviously a very relevant issue in recent months, but those are some examples of specific delegations of authority from the president to the chancellors. There's also some other delegations from the presidents to other people. He delegates to the general officers certain leadership roles. He delegates to the vice presidents certain system personnel actions within their subject matter areas. And he delegates both to the chancellors and the vice presidents the authority to engage consultants, and that's something that Vice President Rapp will touch on here in just a few minutes. So I thought what would be helpful is to walk through CRR 20.030. That's entitled Executive Philosophy. It provides a good summary of what we've been talking about. It's on page 4 of your handouts. But before we walk through it from kind of beginning to end, what I wanted to do was point out language at the end of that rule. And it's the language that says, it is the fundamental responsibility of the board, president, chancellors, and officers to seek and manage resources to achieve the vision and mission of the system. The basic principle that will be followed in leading and managing the system is that authority and accountability will be linked. Remember those textbook definitions at the outset of this presentation, that were 3 components that are always involved in delegation of authority, and that's authority, responsibility, and accountability. So our CRRs match up pretty darn well with those textbook definitions. This CRR has been around for a while. I think it was originally promulgated in 1968, or maybe even earlier. Of note, it was reviewed significantly by a task force in 2018. And that task force was chaired by Curator Chapman, and it consisted of 3 curators, the president, all the chancellors, Vice President Rapp, and me. And the task force reviewed the organizational design of the system. And in particular, it reviewed the roles and responsibilities of the board, the president, and the chancellors. So as part of that review, it spent almost 6 months looking at many things, but including this 20.030. And it made only minor changes. So this is a rule that has withstood the test of time. Well, let's walk through it real quickly, and you'll kind of see what we've been talking about. So on page 4 of your handout is Rule 20.030, Executive Philosophy. And you'll see in the second paragraph that we talk about the system is organized as a system to achieve more collectively than its component parts could be achieved individually. Also in that first paragraph, we set forth the Constitution of Missouri vests the Board of Curators with governing authority for the system. And in the last sentence of that paragraph regarding the board's authority, it says the board delegates decision-making authority to the president of the system, but governing responsibilities always reside with the board, which has the authority to change any decision at any time. The next paragraph of that rule says the president is delegated general authority to act for and on behalf of the board and the system, subject only to the bylaws, board rules, and regulations or specific instructions of the board. It also sets out that the president is the chief executive and academic officer of the system. The next paragraph addresses the chancellors. It says the chancellors of the system are appointed by and report to the president. The chancellors are delegated authority from the president to act as the chief executive and academic officer of their campuses. You'll see skipping the next paragraph and going down to the paragraph that begins with the provost, that was one of the new additions from the 2018 task force. They decided to put in a provision about the provost, but they wanted to make clear that each university provost is delegated authority from the chancellor to act as the chief academic officer. And then the rule finishes with the language that we began with, which is it is the fundamental responsibility of the board, president, chancellors, and officers to seek and manage resources to achieve the vision and mission of the system. This fundamental responsibility compels all general officers to look beyond their individual universities and interests. And then it again reiterates the basic principle that will be followed is that authority and accountability will be linked. So this rule, 20.030, has withstood the passage of time and also withstood a pretty serious review back in 2018 by Curator Chapman's task force. I've also been asked to talk a little bit about shared governance. So what is shared governance? Well, as with delegations of authority, there's lots of different definitions of shared governance, but a good and succinct one, perhaps overly succinct, comes from the Association of Governing Boards white paper on shared governance. It says, and this is a quote, simply put, shared governance is a fundamental principle of inclusion in key areas of institutional responsibility and decision-making. Governing boards hold ultimate authority for the institution. However, through long-standing academic practice, this authority is delegated to or shared with institutional leaders and the faculty. Faculty, or typically faculty, are charged with educational design and delivery. Now, that may be too short of a definition, but it gives you some idea of at least one definition of shared governance. It's important to note that in CRR 10.030, the board expresses its support for shared governance as, quote, a fundamental characteristic of good governance. It's also important to note that shared governance is a delegated authority. First, the board delegates to the president, chancellors, and provosts the authority to act as chief academic officers of their universities. Also within the CRRs is authority delegated to the faculty. And so in looking at least one of those delegations, it says the faculty's authority, as delegated by the curators, is among other things to make decisions on matters directly affecting the educational program. And then in that CRR is a listing of the things that would meet that definition. And so the things to remember about shared governance is that the board retains ultimate and final authority on shared governance matters. That's set forth in our CRRs, but probably most importantly, it's set forth and acknowledged by the AAUP, the American Association of Universities Professors. That's the faculty's group. And it says that the board is the final authority on shared governance matters. The AGB, the Association of Governing Boards, your group, says the board holds ultimate authority for an institution on shared governance matters. So shared governance isn't much different than any other delegated authority. Now, under our scheme, shared governance provisions are contained in what we call the faculty bylaws. The faculty bylaws are promulgated by the faculty, approved by the board, and then codified in CRRs. And you saw an example of that today when Vice President Graham walked you through an amendment to the UMSL faculty bylaws. Those were things that the faculty itself went through its faculty governance processes, came up with some amendments, and then presents it to the board for consideration. The board approves it, it becomes part of the CRRs. Of course, we have 4 sets of faculty bylaws, one for each university in the system, and you can find those faculty bylaws in 300.010 through 300.040. But those are also the bylaws that set forth the shared governance provisions. Another key aspect of the faculty bylaws is the fact that the faculty sets up its own governance and agrees to act through its representative bodies, such as the Faculty Council or the Senate. It's important to remember as we wind this up that the AAU, the AGB, and AAUP recognize shared governance as an important aspect of university governance. Also, our accrediting agency, the Higher Learning Commission, uses it as one of its criteria for whether or not to accredit us. So it looks for a robust system of shared governance, and that's a criteria set forth in Section 2D of the accreditation standards. I've also been asked to address briefly academic freedom, if that can be addressed briefly. But I think it's important to note that everyone agrees it's important. The AGB, the AU, the HLC, the AUP all refer to academic freedom as a core value. The board expresses its support for academic freedom, calling it a fundamental characteristic of good governance. And in 2019, as an outgrowth from the 2018 task force, the university reviewed and amended its mission statement, and it added to the mission statement the fact that it saw academic freedom and freedom of expression as things for which the university must have an unwavering commitment. So what is a definition for academic freedom? Well, it's more stated as principles of academic freedom than an outright definition. But we have it contained in CRR 310.010, which is also set forth on page 6 of your handouts. I'm sorry, either page 5 or page 6 of your handouts. But it's set forth in some detail. So let's walk through those principles that are contained in our CRR. First, it states that the board states that academic freedom is indispensable to the success of the University of Missouri in fulfilling its obligation to the students and to society. That universities are established and maintained for the common good, which depends upon free search for truth and free expression. and that academic freedom is essential to these purposes and applies to both teaching and research. So those are some of the recognized principles of academic freedom that are actually set forth in our CRRs. But along with the rights of academic freedom come some limitations. And those limitations are set forth in our CRR. They're referred to as correlative rights and duties. So our CRR states that faculty members are entitled to freedom in research and in the publication of the results, subject to adequate performance of academic duties. Our CRRs state that faculty members are entitled to freedom in the classroom in discussing their subjects, but have the responsibility not to depart significantly from their respective areas of competence or divert substantial time to material extraneous to the course. And our CRRs state that faculty members have the right to speak or write as citizens, free from institutional censorship or discipline, but they should at all times be accurate, exercise appropriate restraint, show respect for the opinions of others, and make every effort to indicate that they do not speak for the institution. So that's what's in our CRRs about academic freedom, and there's a balance between the freedom as well as the responsibilities imposed. Our CRR is modeled very closely after the AAUP's statement on academic freedom. In fact, some of the language is identical. Academic freedom is also a criteria by which the Higher Learning Commission will judge us. It's much like shared governance in that regard. So we've reviewed the university's rules relating to delegations of authority and the way we get decisions and input from various people and various levels of the organization. Well, what other ways do we get input? Well, one of the ways is through the formation of task forces or advisory committees. So why are they formed? Well, we don't have anything in our CRRs, and we don't have any other guidance that I'm aware of, about why we form task forces in the first place. I think they're probably formed for many of the same reasons that we delegate authority: to gain the expertise of others, to involve people who will have to implement a decision, et cetera. We don't have any CRRs or guidance on how they should operate once they're formed, or what is expected of them. But there is an important difference between delegated authority or delegations of authority and the use of a task force or an advisory committee. With delegated authority, we are delegating authority usually for someone to make a decision. With task forces, we are asking for input to a decision maker. In other words, task forces aren't the decision maker, they aid the decision maker. And I think that's an important distinction. Well, another way that we gain advice or input for others that help us in decision making is through the hiring of outside consultants. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Rapp.
Steve, before you step away from the podium, I want to go back to shared governance just for a moment to make sure I have things understood right. The whole principles and the governance of shared governance, though they're in our CRRs, are actually there as a result of the bylaws of the faculty council or senate, or whatever the correct term is. Is that correct? Do I have that correct?
That is where they're in the CRRs in a section entitled Faculty Bylaws, and they are initiated by the faculty.
Okay. So if there is a change that we would want to make on shared governance, under the current CRRs, are we required to go to the faculty council, get them to amend their bylaws to reapprove them at the board?
Is the question, are you required to? Because I think you'll know.
That is,
I think you'll know my answer.
Okay. So no, I'm not required to. I could unilaterally change that, but when I unilaterally change, by unilateral, I mean the board, the board is unilaterally changing the bylaws of the faculty council.
It's not a question of whether you can, it's a question of whether you should.
Okay, I'll deal with where I want to go from there. Michael takes over. I just wanted to make sure that I had clarity at that point.
Did I answer it so you're clear?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
And Steve, I just want to say, great job. I thought that was very informative. Thank you.
So I'll just drill in a little deeper as in relation to the hiring and use of consultants. It's along the same lines of what Steve went over, but you know, I think when we think about hiring consultants, it's usually for some type of service, or there's times where it's a purchased or outsourced service. So we may be looking for an expert. An example of that is we don't need to, we shouldn't expend the resources to keep an actuary in-house, but we have to go through evaluation every year related to our retirement plan, and we use currently Siegel as our actuary, and that's an example of us using an outside expert. You know, they should have knowledge of either processes, helping us resolve a problem. They can suggest a course of action. They can help us create new knowledge. They can help us identify a problem and then help us develop workable solutions. I would say, though, to Steve's earlier point, they aren't the decision makers and really would just be used to inform a decision, not drive a decision. Who has the approval to hire consultants? Again, that is delegated to each chancellor and the vice presidents. It does come through, each university has a business office. Those contracts have to come through the business office. So for example, if a dean wants to hire a consultant, they will need to not only, you know, they are approving that to say, yes, I have this within my budget, I want to do it, but then they have to submit it through the contracting office as well. I'll get into what needs to be included within that justification. The other thing that we did during the pandemic is we did institute some additional limits in terms of approval being needed. And so for any contracts between, and this isn't just for consultants, but any contract between $10,000 and $100,000 would not only require the authorized signer on the funding source, but would require the approval of the dean or division director. And then for anything exceeding $100,000, it goes to the vice chancellor for finance. And as we've rolled back some of our restrictions from the pandemic, this is one that we actually will continue to keep in our policies as we move forward. What are the things that the business office is looking when they come through with a request to hire a consultant? There has to be a valid business purpose documented. So why do we need to engage a consultant? Do we not have these resources within our current team? Sometimes it's because we have one-time needs. We need to go deep on a particular topic that we don't have the staff for. And then the contracting office also negotiates the terms and conditions and evaluates that for any conflicts of interest. And I did yesterday just what we recorded in our financials as professional and consulting services. And I went back and through May of this year and then compared that to May of the 11 months through May of 20 and May of 19. Keep in mind, we have a fair amount of what's called research consulting that's on grants we have. And so if I take that out, that averages about, over that period of time, it's running somewhere right around 15 million. If you took that out of our professional and consulting spend, the 1 year change, we're down 5.6%, and we're talking about a base of around 75 million. And then if I look at the 2 year change in professional and consulting spend, excluding the research consulting, we're down 13.4%. So that gives you some sense of, I don't think we're using outside consultants at the level we have in the past. Some of that was certainly in response to the pandemic. But with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Ryan, if you don't mind, and I appreciate this information. I like the valid business purpose and the sign-offs. I'm a big believer in hiring the best people we can and paying them well. And you know how I feel about this, but I kind of want to
Yeah.
go over it again. What I don't like to see, and I'm all for bringing in consultants when we need that expert, and there's a valid reason. I feel like some in the past, and I think it is decreased. I don't want to pay somebody to make a decision and then bring in a consultant to make the hard decision when the person we have hired needs to make the decision.
Absolutely, and I think the president and our leadership team has been consistent with you on that. It is not a consultant's not a substitute for leadership. And I think, you know, when we're making decisions, we can use that information, but we as leaders of the institution have to own that decision.
And consultants, it's not a dirty word to me. There are reasons to bring them in when we truly need that expertise. But if we've got people that we've paid to make those decisions, let's have them make the decisions.
Correct.
Thank you.
I want to follow up on Curator Lehman's position. You made reference to something relative to a funding source. Can you elaborate on that for me just for a minute? You know, if the funding source, something you said, then it would have to be approved by the dean.
So, yeah, I'll go. We have, you know, depending on if it's in your general operating fund, if it's a grant fund, you know, listed in our financial system, we have what we call authorized signers. Historically, it would have said, well, these authorized signers, as long as they have the budget, that can be approved. And it would still go through the central contracting office. But then through COVID, what we've added is said, outside of that authorized signer, now we're asking for the dean and division directors to actually, you know, and I'm not saying they weren't reviewing and approving these things in the past, but officially sign off and say, yes, they see the need for this. And then if it's over $100,000, it actually has to come to the campus CFO for approval.
So if I understand you correctly, if a department chair had excess funds and if they had funds in their budget to afford to pay for a consultant that they may want, they could engage a consultant and on their own, and if it got up to above $10,000, they would have to get the dean to sign off on that.
Correct, and the dean still has to sign off on their overall budget. So I'm just trying to, I wouldn't look at that just in a vacuum. I mean, the dean has to say, yes, I approve your overall budget as well.
Yeah, I understand that, but they may, if they have funds left in their budget. So my question becomes, and we shouldn't hire consultants because we have money in our budget. There's money in our budget that's not being used. It should be returned back up to the dean, to the school, to the college, all the way back up, not spent on a consultant or some other, and I'll use consultants this time, but because we're talking about consultants, because it's there. And I would really like to see a better checks and balance on the hiring of a consultant, as opposed to saying, yeah, I got the money to do it. And there are a lot of motivations that could go into that, as to whether or not we should spend it that way or whether or not it should be spent differently. And it's going back to where Jeff's at. I think I've seen, in just the year I've been on here, we've hired consultants to gain justification for a tough decision or to hide behind a consultant's recommendation on a tough decision, as opposed to standing up and saying, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, and I'm going to stand up and we're going to do that. Because the end result is the same. We saved $9,900 because we didn't have to ask the dean to do that. If that helps clarify things as to my position in there.
But haven't we really been talking about that we wanted to be clear what the excess funds in different departments or colleges, not worried so much just about consultants, but that they're used wisely? And we know, I think UMSL's one who has been pretty aggressive on kind of sweeping those funds up to broader campus mission. Isn't that really the goal, of making this less about consultants, but how that excess money gets used?
Yes,
At the end of the fiscal
ultimately
year?
it is to
Yeah.
me, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think it's a little bit broader than just talking about consultants.
I agree
Okay.
with you.
And President Choi, I think you had a comment?
No, I think Curator
I
Lane
want to
has
ask
go
one more
first.
question, if you don't mind, Ryan.
And I'll go after. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I have one more thing, Ryan. Obviously, the way you're keeping track of this and organizing this, is that something we can see, maybe quarterly?
Yeah,
Or whatever.
we can.
You've got a lot to do, and
Sure.
you're really great about getting us info, but maybe if there was a reasonable way to show us, hey, here's what we're looking at year-to-date on consultants.
So we submit our quarterly financial report. It would be any problem for us to incorporate
break it
that
out.
in there and break that out.
Thank you.
So going back to the question that Curator Holbrook and Curator Lehman asked, I want to reflect on the first part of the presentation where our general counsel talked about authority, responsibility, and accountability. So you are right. It's not just about consulting, but overall use of resources that are generated, for the most part, from state taxpayers and tuition that's generated from students and parents. And so we have to ask the question, should we do this, or should we use it for the key mission, which is student success, perhaps more scholarship, or research, hiring faculty and providing the resources and the salaries that they need so that they are retained at the university? So those are really great questions, and accountability has to be there. We are fiduciaries.
Well, let me just say that this is why Moon is a, let me just say, this is why Moon is a great leader. Because the first question I wanted us to discuss is, while we talk about, authority, responsibility, and accountability, we spend a lot of time talking about responsibility. But I think part of what we're missing, or what I want to discuss today, is when we talk about the authority to delegate, how are we making sure that we as a board are staying accountable and holding people accountable? And I wanted to get some thoughts on that, and Moon just led us right into it.
I am so bashful. It is really hard for me to comment. Curator Williams, you've hit the nail on the head exactly. I think that we as curators have got to engage ourselves enough to hold primarily Moon accountable, to hold the chancellor accountable, to hold the dean accountable for the delegation of authority we gave them, and whether or not they are making the decisions in the fiduciary interest that we hold as curators. And I think we have got to find a mechanism to do that without becoming micromanaging of the university, which I don't think any of us has a desire to, nor any of us has the
Time,
time.
yeah.
And I have struggled in trying to answer that question for myself. You and I had a conversation as to when you should jump in and when you shouldn't jump in. And for different curators, we're laughing because Curator Williams and I had a private conversation about this very issue, and it was when it really, really matters, and it's of huge importance, and on and on and on. And I reminded him of an issue he wanted to bring forward, and he said, I got it, because those things are individual to curators. And so how do we open that box up so that we can protect, so that we can see that our fiduciary responsibilities are dealt with correct with the delegation we've given on accountability side of that, without becoming burdensome to Moon and all the chancellors. Somewhere in there's got to be a mix. I wish I could tell you, Curator Williams, I've got the answer, but I don't.
I'd like to ask Curator Graham, as a person that we all look up to with probably the most experience on this board, Curator Marcy, can you please speak to this issue based on your experience?
Well, yeah, I can, and I think that's why I think that's why the presentation that Steve and Ryan made is so important. Because when you talk about shared governance, and that's the words that were used for so many years, and now we talk about delegation of authority. If you ask, even among the 9 curators, what that means, even right now, you would not get identical answers.
True.
I mean, that's the problem, and that's the challenge. If you ask the chancellors, 3 of these chancellors, what it means, you would not get the same answer. And so the devil continues to be in the details. And that's why I think discussions like we're having now are important. And I am one who has preached for several years the danger of curators trying to micromanage the university. And I think it happens. I mean, I think it has happened in our university. I think it's happening periodically now. And the danger is that curators don't recognize that they're engaging micromanaging. So I don't think it's a result of ill will. It's just a result of not thinking.
Yeah, I think the can versus should, that Steve mentioned is an important concept.
And I think,
Go ahead, Michael.
yeah, I think when we had this discussion, and I do not remember who all was in this discussion, but I remember we raised a great point. It's the lawyer weasel word. And it was like, unless something has happened that you find arbitrary and capricious, should you just try to get involved in a decision because you would have done it differently? And as I use those weasel words, I will admit, Curator Hobrock came back to me and said, now let's apply this to what you want to do. And you literally, sometimes you have to turn a mirror on yourself and say, wow, okay, I get what you're saying, and let's rethink this. And so, others, what are your thoughts on this and when you should or should not be getting involved in these decisions?
We're involved in all of the decisions, and if there's something that you want to change, all you have to do is decide on what the goal is and set it. And then you measure whether we got there or not. That's different than managing. So we all approve budgets today, and we'll be held accountable for meeting them next year. But if you want to create the budget, you're managing.
I think that's a good point, and I think it's important that we don't do our work. Being a curator is so unbelievably important to the mission of our university, and we can't do our job with blinders on. I mean, we really have to be attentive to the issues before us and be willing to ask the tough questions and to bring up issues that we think are important. I think that's our responsibility. And it remains difficult for me even to try to identify that line that I shouldn't go beyond. And I suspect all of us have dealt with that from time to time. But this is a working job, being a curator. And the responsibilities to our leadership, our students, the people of Missouri, our faculty, everybody who cares so much about our mission, the responsibility is a big, big responsibility.
But that's for any board, right? And I guess, this is a subject that's close to home for me as the corporate secretary for Cigna. And we have board members on a corporate board that, always want more information. And of course, we're going to give them more information. But there are risks to board members making managerial decisions when they have limited information. So the governance and oversight function of a board is very different from management for many good reasons. And when we step too far into making decisions or imposing as opposed to setting the goals and holding, the administration responsible for meeting the goals. Those are very different roles, and you should make sure you have the right people in the roles. But you run a real risk of making the wrong decisions with limited information and expertise in an area. And so that's the way that we approach it. And, this board is a group of wonderful people who care. Any board that has ever probably served in these roles have cared. But there's not even like a background criteria of expertise that's required to fill these roles. And so I just want us to be careful to ask questions and to set difficult standards and goals. But it's very dangerous to make decisions that management is making with all the information and the staff and being on the ground and doing this day to day and having the background and expertise to do it. If we don't like what they're doing, we make changes to the administration. But I just, from a risk standpoint, that's something that we train our board on. We recruit new members all the time. There's turnover. And it takes a while to get up to speed and be a really good contributing board member in the corporate world. But we recruit people based upon their areas of expertise, and it's just a different world. But even they don't know, with an area of expertise that they have that we're recruiting, the inner workings of the company or, how things are done at Cigna or healthcare. And so education is a whole different regulated ball of wax. And I just think that we've got a lot of financial pressures, and we've got to continue to set hard targets to meet, and we have to hold everybody accountable, including ourselves, to get the job done.
Can I ask Todd, our newest curator, what his thoughts are, coming in and kind of experiencing and hearing about this immense power that the board has and our discretion to make decisions and to get in the weeds, as they say, So what has been your impression, and what do you think about this topic?
I mean, what everyone said is enlightening and interesting, but this is a topic that's been debated since, I assume, 1875. And that's half the
True.
And that's half the job of the board, is to decide what they should get involved in and what they shouldn't. Yeah. I do think that nonprofit boards, which this is not a nonprofit board, but in a for-profit board, you all know that the objective is to make the shareholders' value as high as it can be. It's profitability. This board has a responsibility to certainly consider the outlook of the students, consider the outlook of the faculty, consider the outlook of the administrators, but this is the University of Missouri, not the University of Columbia, Missouri, not the University of, we have a lot of other things that I think we're supposed to reflect, or otherwise we would pick our own successive boards. We are picked in a governmental process. And so we have to consider those things. And from time to time, I think we have to, we will want to get involved in things that aren't I don't know where the line of management and guidance is, but I just think that we could debate this for, years if we wanted to. And it's important that we do. I don't think it's a waste of time that we're doing this, but I don't think that there's a clear answer. This is this and this is that, and never the two shall meet. I think what Marcy said was important, that we just have to constantly be vigilant and think about it. And but at times there'll be things that's like this, this does not reflect where the University of Missouri should be, and we want to make a statement on that.
Great point. Robin?
I was thinking about different things that many of you have shared with me when I first got on the board. And a couple things for me that I'm always asking myself is, when we're talking about decisions, is it going to affect, enhance, or decrease the value of the university? And I mean that as a reputation, a brand, the finance. And I'm pretty sure Vice President Rapp said this to me in my training. But a lot of times we're here to pressure test ideas. To give that point of view, to push back, but not to jump in and cross that line from governance into management. So that's some of the ways I keep thinking about it. I don't know that that's 100% correct, but I'm trying to stay that course and be pretty consistent. But I think I've owned a couple times where I know I've stepped over the line. And it certainly happens when we get passionate about particular particular topic. But I'm always happy for anybody to check me, so I appreciate
I've
that.
noticed that when it's important to me, it's not in the weeds.
Right.
When it's important- They're in the weeds, so.
We all feel that way.
You are reflecting what Curator Holbrook has told me.
That's right.
Well, that's a good point. And we all fall in that same trap. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
Because we all have different interests and yeah, that's the problem we face.
One of the things that I truly struggle with this, I could use several examples, and it's actually probably no surprise in here that I'm a numbers person in dollars and cents, and as Moon and I had a conversation yesterday, it's not that maybe the university doesn't have enough money, we just might not be spending it the right way to achieve the mission of the university, that we could take it farther. And so I'm going to use a specific example, and it's at UMKC. And Molly, I'm not trying to pick on you, but you're somewhat aware of this whole thing. I was called by somebody that says, Greg, have you looked at the STEAM distribution system at UMKC? Well, no, as a matter of fact, I have not. Okay? And he said, do you mind if I send you a report that was done, that they'd hired by, I think it was Roger Schmidt Engineering Firm, and let you look through it? And I sure sent it to me. I read the report, and I said, okay, so what are you telling me? And they said, well, we think we can help you do this, but we can't get anybody at UMKC to talk to us, and on and on and on and on and on. And I said, okay, so let me lay out some parameters of what's going on. And so we established some ground rules, just so to speak, and I called up Ryan Rapp. I said, Ryan, here's what I know. Here's what I know. I'm smart enough to read this report from Eric Schmidt to realize that if we're not making a substantial investment in the STEAM distribution system at the UMKC campus, and we're not looking at it now, we're going to wake up one day and Molly's going to call up here and say, guys, I've got no steam to all my buildings. We're toast. That's a true reality going on at UMKC right now. Getting Ryan involved, who got UMKC involved, they've at least now got beyond the idea that somebody could do it better than we do it. They're not saying somebody can do it. The possibility exists that they can. Now, here comes the dilemma that I face. Is that management? Or is that being a board member? The university already had those reports. The university already knew their options. When does it become getting into the weeds, and when does it become doing your fiduciary duty?
But is your question one of when should it flow up to the board?
Or when should I, you know, for me, it's like, you know, a guy sends me the report, I read the report and say, holy schmoly, should I just say, well, that's a management issue? And it truly is a management issue to deal with. But I know that if it doesn't get dealt with, it's to become a fiduciary duty to this board. Is that?
I think that's one on the duty of management to disclose material issues, right? It's not, I think yours, if I understand what you're saying, I think what you're saying is, but for this being shared with you outside of the board context, you wouldn't have been aware of it.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think that's another issue, right? I mean, when we first, back when I first joined the board, I think Daryl and Jeff will recall, and Moon had just started as well, so, you know, he's getting his arms around it, and I think that there's a sense that things were always done a certain way, and it was the board meetings seemed to be like I don't mean this disrespectfully, but like a show and tell of all the positives. Here are all the things that we did. And like we knew we weren't doing as well as we could. And I think our perspectives were, well, let's talk about the problems. You know, let's talk about, you know, some of the things that we're not doing as well, not for the purpose of lashing anybody, but for us to focus our time and energy on making positive changes that'll help the institution and the state. And so I think that kind of goes back to what you're experiencing, and I think there has to be it does go back to the board setting expectations. And I don't have an easy answer for you, but I think management has an obligation to share the material issues with the board that are equally important to some of the things that may be positives or that they want to achieve, because it has an impact. And just one last thing is, it's funny to me because I think the corporate governance structure is a lot more aligned to the university governance structure in many ways, with the Business Roundtable, where several companies have signed on to that and have acknowledged not that the goal of the corporation is to simply generate money for shareholders, but that it has an obligation to each of its constituent stakeholders, which includes employees, the community, as well as shareholders and others. But there's more of an obligation now to do the right thing as opposed to just making money. So I think it's kind of funny that these issues converge, but it's an issue that everyone struggles with in terms of, sharing information that's not quite flattering, and having the information that the board needs in order to discharge its fiduciary duty. I agree with you.
I think this is great dialogue. I wanted to involve President Choi in this. President Choi, I'm sure you've experienced a whole lot of folks getting in the weeds, including myself at times. I'm sure you've experienced board members that that are right at the right level of interest. How does that make you feel, and how do you think it makes other administrators feel, when you're dealing with this varying degree of curator behavior, activity, we just want to get your perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Chapman. Well, I'm looking at my administrator colleagues, and they have accused me of micromanaging. So I think they know how it feels. And but this is what I've shared with our colleagues. It is our responsibility to have a great relationship with the board, but it can't be, obviously, a rubber stamp board, because you have an important responsibility. It's also your responsibility to hire the very best people, hold them accountable, so use the principle of trust but verify, because it's that important. It is that important. Now, in terms of working relationship, for us to have that trust but verify, it starts with trust. But in the verification process, you run into issues, meaning targets are not met, or you were told something that just wasn't true, or you're not provided with material information that may have a very deleterious effect on the university. That means that you don't have the people that you can trust, and you need to make a change. Now, I don't think we feel that from the board. What we know from the board is I've been here since March 1st, 2017, and I've shared with all of you, the board members care deeply about the university. That's why they want to know more information, and they want to help. They want to help. But you're absolutely right. Just like I don't know at times, how far do I need to go to do someone else's job, because I don't want that particular function to fail, but to pull back. Because when I do that, people around that administrator are saying to each other, Moon's lost confidence in that person. And that's the last thing that I want to do. I'd rather have a direct conversation with that person and say, I've lost confidence in you. We need to make some changes. And so I'm learning through this process. And so it is a discussion that we're going to continue to have, because yes, I think it's happened since 1875. But if we all start with the premise of respect, trust with verification, we're going to do just fine. We're going to do just fine. So thank you, Chair Chapman.
I think we can all, this is something we all can work on weekly, daily, you know, but great conversation. Any other Jeff?
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts, if you don't mind. And I'm thinking back, as you said, you started March of 17, Julia, as you mentioned. I think April of 17 we started. And I think there's another component, which is, quite frankly, I think there was a lot of things wrong back then. And I think curators were much more in the weeds. And as things improved, and I believe things have improved every year, and my guess is that will continue to go. I think we got less in the weeds because, quite frankly, the university has ran far better today than it was in 2017, 2016. That's my opinion. But I also think the board has a role. And if a curator believes that something's important, then I think the respect that the other curators have, that it's probably important, and I'd rather hear about it than not hear about it, quite frankly.
Agreed.
So, hey, let me ask you a quick question. So is that, when you hear something like that, that just made me think, is it that the curator should then go to the other curators, or should he go, or her, go to Moon or to Ryan, or how does that, because we keep talking about curators, but we're talking about an individual as opposed to a majority of the board. At least that's what just struck me.
No, me too.
And so
Good question.
I wonder, what's the thought on that? Should the curator go straight to Moon? Should the curator talk to other curators and say, does anybody else see a problem here? Or what's our thinking?
Can I, and I want Marcy to chime in on this too. I do think that I'll throw this out here. I do think that we do not operate individually at all. We are a board. So I would think it would be wise to call and then get at least 4 other curators along with you. You know, get your majority. And then, and I'll tell you what, I'll tell you what.
You just ruined Owen's afternoon. You ruined his whole afternoon.
But I'll tell you what, you know, I think that what I've noticed when I've done that is certain curators call someone that has a differing viewpoint than you. And they will pull you off the ledge pretty quick, you know, sometimes. So listening to your other curators, I think, is a good idea, first step in the process. Other times they may say, hey, you didn't think about this, you didn't think about that. So I think just calling your curators to get a gut check before the knee-jerk reaction to call an administrator and say, I don't like this, I think is the best way to go. Just my personal view.
I think you're right, though, because then the administrator doesn't understand if you are speaking for yourself or for the full board, and it puts them kind of in a bind of what to do next. So we really need to be cautious and thoughtful about how we engage each other, and then I assume, from my point of view, send that through the chair if it needs to be elevated.
Mindfulness.
Mindfulness
Marcy,
instead of thoughtfulness.
Yeah, and Daryl, you know, you and I have had an example of that recently where you know, we had a call and talked about a very sensitive issue and shared ideas. And I that was helpful to me, and I hope it was helpful to you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, but you know, there's one other dynamic at work here that I think we need to recognize. And when we talk about, I'll use shared governance or delegation of authority, in 2021, it's not the shared governance. Even Moon, when you came here, I mean, higher education has changed, and it's been transformative change. And we're changing, you know, even now with the end of the pandemic. And higher education is never going to be the same as it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I think that the pressures that higher education with you know, so much competition now with declining enrollment. I just made a note, the pressure on student outcome, student placement, all of the competition that higher education is getting now. We're dealing with issues that are totally different than we dealt with when many of us came on the board. So that's going to require changes, maybe better communication, but it is going to put an additional burden on curators to stay on top of the issues and to be willing to ask questions and to seek information. And I think Moon expressed it the way that I think curators should do that, is do it with respect. I think it's important that curators check with one another from time to time. The unhealthiest thing that a corporate board can have, or that a board of curators, or any management group, the worst thing that can happen is to have a clique that talk among themselves and not to anybody else. That is so unhealthy and so dangerous that it is something we all need to be conscious of and cautious to avoid, because that's a killer for a progressive organization.
And I think that us not having a chance to all get to know each other and be in person over the last 18 months is probably, I think it's harder to trust and work well as a team if you don't know each other. So I think, thank God, we're all together again and we're able to get to know each other. But I think it's easier for people who know each other to reach out to one another. But I think, Daryl, you're right. I think we have an obligation not to see things just from our own points of view. We have an obligation to try to get to what's best for the University of Missouri and for Missouri. And I think to do that, we have to seek other points of view on a great many topics before we form our own conclusions, which is hard.
I think you asked me a question. Curator Graham and I were having a conversation in St. Louis, and two of the things that I thought came out of this year was it's very easy to think you get to 5 and you have a consensus and a vote, but we need to care about everybody's point of view, and that so often that additional point of view moves you a foot to the right or to the left, and we end up loving the outcome, and that we may not all agree, but we can get to a better outcome. I think that's important. And then I think this is probably to your point, Curator Burnsick, on the pandemic. I think it can be easy to lose sight that we really are here all for the same mission and the same purpose, to serve our state and to serve this university. And when we have not had the chance to build those relationships, I think you can lose sight of that at times. And I appreciate you asked me that question. It made me think a lot about this last year.
Well, we had a good discussion, and quite frankly, if we're all in total agreement all of the time, we're not doing our job.
No.
Something's wrong.
There's a
if
German
that's the
saying
case.
that if two businessmen agree on everything, one of them is useless.
And so before I hand over this bully pulpit, there's one other thing that we haven't talked about, and we kind of talked about the use of consultants and experts, but we haven't talked about the use of task force, because that's another delegation that I don't think we as a board has ever discussed, whether, what do we think about task force? Should we be providing better guidelines, better directions? Should we be involved in the business of task force, or is that something that should be delegated to the Council of Chancellors, to the President, whatever? Since we're going to go into discussing task force recommendations, I wanted to make sure we discussed that so there was a general opinion on that before we get back on schedule.
I'll jump in on that. I'm appreciative of task force. I think what's been interesting, and maybe it's a pandemic side effect, is that sometimes the initial charge is not what ends up being carried through, and that creates some challenges. I'm not sure it's our job to go back and try to check them, or if it's the administrator, President Choi, or one of the chancellors, to go back and hold them to the charge, but to help guide. I don't want to say hold them, maybe guide. But I think that's been part of the challenges with task force, is starting off one place and ending up somewhere different. And that's okay with the recommendations, but it's not okay on the charge.
Well, you can start and end wherever you want, but the board's going to make a decision based upon, the information and the deliberation of the board.
Right.
So I don't think that because a task force comes back with a recommendation that the board's option is to accept it or reject it. I think it's part of the information, just like a consultant or anyone else. But obviously, the intent is to have an informed decision. But, it's kind of like everyone's voice should be heard, but we don't expect that everyone's going to get their way.
100%.
So that to me is what shared governance is about. And hopefully, we end up more aligned than not.
Interesting to hear your position. The one side of task force that I share exactly what you're saying is from the receiver of the information that thank you for the recommendation, and we'll make a decision with your recommendations and your thoughts in mind. But on the other hand, those people appointed to the task force sometimes have a different view on that. You put us together, we went out there and worked, we've made a recommendation to us, and you didn't accept it. Okay, but from their perspective, if you're not going to accept what we offer you, why did you ask us to do it? And I think sometimes there is the expectation that the task force is making the decision, as opposed to the task force, from their perspective, as a task force job is to offer a recommendation and an opinion. And I don't know how we keep that clarity there, especially when it comes to very difficult issues.
I think size, there's certain qualities of certain task forces that I've been involved in that are detrimental to how the task force operates or the level of dysfunction. And some work good. We talked about one today that worked great. I think the number of people on the task force sometimes is an issue. If it's a very kind of a polarizing issue, there's bound to be maybe some level of dysfunction there. So you've got to really put tight guardrails around it in the beginning. So I think we've just got to develop a plan based on the situation we're in, the question we're asking, and really get out in front of issues before they start with task forces, if we establish a task force in the first place. So just some thoughts there.
And I don't want us to walk away, or somebody having the impression we don't value those, because as you said, there was one that they did, was it audit this morning that had a task force? No, it was on patents. You had a task force, Ryan did. They obviously came back and, worked very well. We certainly have, I can think of, Marshall Stewart has groups, advisory groups that, provide key stakeholder input. So I don't want to overgeneralize that all of these are not going to be effective or not heard.
Agree.
Robin, I want you to just talk a little bit more about the stakeholder buy-in and your, kind of, since you've been involved in all sides of the university and the system, how he's, setting the right size, making stakeholders feel invested, but also making them understand that we value your opinion, but we still have to sit down and discuss it.
One of the things that comes up a lot, I'll give an easy example, is search committees. There's always a big interest in making sure that different representative groups are sit on that group. And I think that's maybe how I see it being effective, is that you're making sure you're covering faculty and staff. I mean, you can't get every person's point of view across, from a staff or faculty, alumni, students. And I think we consistently try to do that. I think we sometimes lose sight when we get too large, because we end up with so many, kind of to your point, I think, Curator Graham, about cliques, we end up with these fractures within them. But I think if we ask everyone for their opinion, when I see them work effectively is when they're very clear they're going to have a recommendation, but we have the different stakeholder groups at the table who get to weigh in. But when we set that at the beginning, for example, a chancellor search committee, they're very clear that President Choi is going to make that decision. They're making a recommendation, and that is reinforced over and over. But everybody who is a key stakeholder in the university is generally at the table on that and knows that they were a part of it, and then reflects back to their respective communities.
Now, for the sake of time, I'd like to, maybe we talk about next steps. Michael, you okay with that? Did you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
No, that was my last question. I am now handing the bully pulpit.
But before we change.
Go ahead. Oh.
Before we change, and maybe I'm the only curator that has a problem with the structure of how we've structurally set up shared governance. I have a problem that we've done it through the faculty bylaws as opposed to doing it within our own we've not done it just in our own rules. So to be clear, our general counsel tells me I have the right to unilaterally change the faculty bylaws to address shared governance. He also cautions me, should I do it that way? The answer to that question, folks, is no, I should not. Okay? No, I shouldn't. So my position is, I think that we should take shared governance, and I'm not suggesting to change the faculty bylaws, but to write within our own CRRs that we don't have to go to anybody else and deal with the whole concept of shared governance. And then if the faculty wants to change their bylaws to match what we're doing, that's their right, that's their privilege. Please do it, bring them back for approval. And if they don't want to, that is their right, their privilege, and don't. But we're then in a position to deal with the issue of shared governance through our own rules, as opposed to have to deal with shared governance through the faculty bylaws. You talk about the steps forward. I think that we should look at that and decide and analyze the pros and the cons of doing that, and the good and the bad, and the whole 9 yards of things. But in this process, I'm not telling you I want to change the definitions of shared governance. That's not what I'm saying. I just don't like the way I would have to do it if I elected, or I wanted to bring it up, or this board wanted to do that. And that's, I just don't like the structure of it, I guess is what I'm saying.
Greg, my answer to that would be, that could be really an important and much longer discussion for another day. But I think we still have to keep in mind that whatever it is, delegation of authority or shared governance, still has to have a collaborative aspect to it. It does have to have a collaborative aspect, but it also has to have a decisive aspect. And the decisive aspect is with the board, you're right. But there's still got to be a strong collaborative part of this.
Right.
You're talking about shared governance.
Right. I'm talking about collaboratively doing it. I'm not trying to make it one-sided and dictatorial. I just don't like the idea that if we wanted to address that, we have to address it with our hand behind our back.
Address it at some other time.
At some other time, yes.
Well, good point, Greg, and I agree with you, and kind of understand what you're saying. Well, let's do this. I made a list as you guys were talking of things that I think that we can work on, and maybe talk about at a later date. Things that I think we could probably improve. And Greg, so I noted your point about having our own set of shared governance rules or standards in the collective rules versus relying on the faculty bylaws. That's an idea. Jeff, your idea about consultants, I know you said maybe you'd like some quarterly reports on how much we're spending on consultants. The use of task forces, what the threshold is, how we use them, how we're advising them. We can work on that. The can versus should concept that Steve brought up, I think this is a very important concept. And I think part of another great idea that our general counsel, Steve, mentioned was using a judicial review standard, this arbitrary and capricious standard. We have the authority to go in and reverse decisions, but that's not probably good governance, right? We have to show respect for those folks that we work with and that report to us. So how do we as curators decide, that an issue is important enough, that the people that made the decision made a bad decision, didn't look at all the facts, whatever. How do we reach that threshold where curators can actually get involved and say, hey, we don't like that, let's take a second look at it. This is my list of things. There may be some things that I missed, I don't know, but I think that we can put our heads together after this meeting and say, how do we address this stuff? I don't think we can come up with all the answers now for sure, right, Todd? It's been going on for a long time. I don't think we're gonna solve it today, but we can at least put some of these things on our agenda to keep working on, okay? So any other questions? I appreciate the discussion. Steve, thank you for putting the presentation together. Ryan, Christine, Moen. Any further thoughts, and or else we can get on to our next topic. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Okay. Speaking of task forces, our next order of business is an action item regarding the Thomas Jefferson Statute contextualization recommendation. Christine, can you give us a brief background on that recommendation?
Thank you, Curator Chapman and board members. As you are aware, communities across the nation have been debating the appropriate ways to handle public figures with very complex legacies and the monuments raised in their honor. And certainly we are no different than many communities and universities across the nation. So last July, President Choi actually convened a small task force to examine this topic related to Thomas Jefferson. So today I'd like to provide a very brief description on the Thomas Jefferson Contextualization Task Force proposal. The full proposal was submitted by the task force this past spring. It was also released to the public, and the proposal was submitted by more than a half dozen, or more than a dozen, I should say, staff, faculty, students, curators, alumni, and we also had a historian as a part of the task force. And as part of the charge, the group was to explore ways to contextualize the contributions of the life and legacy of Thomas Jefferson. Certainly, it was to look at his strengths as well as his shortcomings. And the proposal, or the task force, actually came back, and given the formidable challenge that they had and the diversity of opinions, they proposed and put forth a proposal to include a wayside sign with 300 words with brief references to Thomas Jefferson's roles in the Louisiana Purchase, the Declaration of Independence, and also his ownership of slaves. So that is it in a nutshell. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to entertain them, but that's the brief introduction related to the proposal.
Okay, thank you, Christine. So I think our next step here is to put up, Cindy, if you don't mind, putting up the resolution. Yes. So this is a resolution that we have come up with to kind of address the Thomas Jefferson recommendation. And we're going to hand them out too, right? Right, Greg? Okay,
Valerie's going to hand them out.
great.
Greg, does this have a change?
This is the first resolution you and I talked, no, this is on the Thomas Jefferson. This resolution does not contain reference to the QR code at this point in time. I do have prepared a resolution that does reference the QR code. If that becomes what the board wants to do, then I would, and let's be clear here, Chairman, I'm not offering this as a motion to adopt.
Of course.
We have it on the screen as to open discussion. Oh, I have prepared this to open the discussion on this topic to get started. I do know that the issue of the QR code is important to many members of the board. Some of them feel hugely important that we should have a QR code, and there are some that don't support that view.
And Greg, just, Christine didn't cover that part of the recommendation, and I don't want to pull you back up here, but Christine, would it be fair to say that part of the recommendation, in addition to the wayward sign, was to post a QR code? That is correct. Okay. So just, since
Yes.
that hadn't been
Yes.
kind of
Thank
introduced,
you.
I wanted to help provide
Yeah,
the context.
So thank you. So when this subject was going to come up, I can tell you the following about, and so I'm going to speak now for myself and why I've done what I have done and what I have prepared, and why I have actually prepared two resolutions in my conversations individually, Steve, with with board members and staff and others. First, I started by reading not everything I could read, it'd be still reading, but I read quite a bit on Thomas Jefferson for myself and tried to understand the man and the complexities of him. And I spent a lot of time reading letters written back and forth between he and Adams and others, and I read the letters themselves. And really what I found interesting in the whole thing is I read the letters myself, and then I read what historians said about them. It was amazing to me that two historians could read the same letter and walk away with two entirely different views. More than that, they could read the same paragraph and quote the same paragraph to support opposing sides. But even more than that, they could take the same sentence out of the same paragraph to support their opposing views. So given all that, I do not believe in any way, shape, and form that we can put on a plaque anything that everybody could agree to, that regardless of what we put on a plaque and we put there, we were going to upset somebody. It's impossible. I've come to the conclusion it's impossible. I think I said impractical or something of that regard.
Unattainable.
I recognize the importance that slavery was. I recognize that slavery is an ugly scar of this country. but it's a scar that this country is going to wear for its entire existence and beyond. There is nothing we can do here today. There is nothing that anybody can ever do to remove that scar. We are going to live with it. I do not believe slavery was right. It was not right. I am not trying to support it. And I recognize that enslaved people contributed to this university, they contributed to the economic development of this country, and they were hugely important to this country. I fundamentally don't believe that I should be judging the actions of individuals that occurred 250 years ago or 200 years ago by the standards we employ today. I just don't believe we should do that. The committee did a lot of work, the task force did a lot of work, and I respect them for what they have done. But I cannot support putting a wayward sign up that tries to put it all there because I don't believe it will do any good. I think it will cause more harm than good in the long run of this university. I do believe there is merit in considering putting a QR code that would link the statute to relevant historical documentation for people to read for themselves, for them to come to their own opinions, to read the letters that Jefferson wrote, to read the letters that people wrote to Jefferson, to read about what he did in Virginia in the legislation, to understand that his first draft of the Declaration of Independence dealt with slavery, and for themselves decide for themselves. So with that is a resolution, a form of the resolution that I have presented here. And as I said, I have another form to present that would have dealing with the QR code. I can tell you the second resolution still does not have the wording on the wayward sign. I fundamentally cannot support that for the reasons I stated. However, I could be easily persuaded to put up a QR code to deliver it. So I will shut up at that point.
Well, if you,
Oh, yes, go ahead. And I want full discussion because I think we've got some board members with some very good, good thoughts, and I want to hear all perspectives as we move forward here.
so kind of continuing upon the task force discussion that we just had, you know, we've all read the task force recommendation, and one of the ideas in it, I think for many reasons that you articulated, Greg, by virtue of the inability of the task force to come back with a unanimous recommendation, with the report of the task force expressly acknowledging that there were many different views, I too think that putting a 300-word, accurate, fulsome, you know, all-encompassing, the good, the bad, and the ugly discussion of Jefferson with, it would be impossible. That said, and as we also discussed a little earlier, the other recommendation, or one of the recommendations in the report with the QR code, I did a little research of my own, and I wanted to share with you part of the reason that I support putting a QR code up. I read a little bit of Annette Gordon-Reed, who is the professor of American legal history at Harvard Law School, and she's noted for changing scholarship on Thomas Jefferson regarding his relationship with Sally Hemings and her children. She's won a Pulitzer Prize for History, National Book Award, and many others for this work and scholarship. And she was asked, she's also an African-American woman, she was asked what she thought about removing Jefferson from college campuses, and specifically Williams and Mary, as well as the University of Missouri, Columbia. And Gordon-Reed said she didn't think Jefferson statues should be taken down. Further, she said it is important to distinguish Jefferson, whatever his record on slavery, from figures associated with the Confederacy or Jim Crow for whom there may not be any reason for honors on campuses to continue. She's quoted as saying, "I understand why some people think his statues should be removed, but not all controversial figures of the past are created equal. I think Jefferson's contributions to the history of the United States outweigh the problems people have with aspects of his life. He is just too much a part of the American story to pretend that he was not there. This conversation about statues and symbols really got going with calls to take symbols and figures from the Confederacy out of the public sphere. Then it shifted to every famous person who is an enslaver and/or white supremacist, basically letting the Confederates off the hook. That's a lot of people to be disappeared. There's every difference in the world between being one of the founders of the United States and being a part of a group of people who fought to destroy the United States. She added, "It's a line-drawing function, but we draw lines all the time. Statues and buildings for Jefferson Davis and John C. Calhoun? No. Statues and buildings for Thomas Jefferson? Yes. But with interpretation and conversations about all the meanings of his life and influences, good and bad. The words of the Declaration of Independence that blacks have made use of over the years, and Monticello, his home, a slave plantation that has now become a site for substantive discussions about race and slavery, exist together as part of our history, just as he was. He drafted the Declaration, he was a president, he founded a university, he championed religious freedom. The best of his ideals continue to influence and move people. The statues should be a stimulus for considering all these matters at William and Mary and the University of Missouri. And I think as an institution whose mission is to educate, I could see us really playing a role there. And anyone who thinks you can find the words that she has written in her books over Google, you're wrong. You can find the book and then you can buy it, but I think we can do better than that in making something available in furtherance of education.
Thank you, Julia. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on a QR code?
Well, I agree with most of this. I think it seems like, to me, it's problematic to try to fit, Thomas Jefferson on a 300-word wayside sign. I mean, I just think it's too limiting. But I really don't see the purpose in the QR code because, to me, it's limiting. If you do a Google search, as you mentioned, you have 192 million results on Thomas Jefferson. I mean, what are we going to put on the QR code? You know what I mean? It's going to be, it's going to tell a story. I just don't think that's our role as curators. You can go to Google, you can read John Meacham's book, The Art of Power, which is a phenomenal book on Thomas Jefferson, right? You can go to the library. You can ask your professor, right? To me, the QR code just kind of limits. It's like, what are we going to say there? You know what I mean? Why not just open it all up? Because there's a lot of facts there. And I don't see how it's our role to kind of limit down the facts of Thomas Jefferson.
I tend to agree. Anybody else got any thoughts on that topic?
I'll say from sitting on the committee, which I know Curator Chapman and Curator Williams, I think it's easy to look at this report and think that, I don't remember how many people were on the committee, 15, 20, I can't remember, that there was even remotely an idea of consensus on those 300 words. That would not be a fair representation of the outcome. So for me, that's such a set aside. There was disagreement from one of the historians with one of the professors. I mean, it was really challenging to even get to this place. And y'all remember, we voted paragraph by paragraph, and the same people didn't remotely vote from one place to another. So this looks like a summary of the outcome of the process. It's not really. It was lots of fragments and lots of parts. So it would be hard for me to move forward on that. I'm probably like Curator Hobrock. I'm fine with the QR code. You did say the relevant links, and I don't know what you mean by relevant.
Relevant links would be links that when you see the QR code, we do not go to the one with QR, how we're going to construct it. We don't say a QR code to Ellis Library. We don't say a QR code to Monticello. Actually, somebody suggested let's just take a QR code to the Library of Congress. I thought, yeah, that would take a lot of reading to get through all that. And Jeff, at that point, you might get all 13 million matches. But if we were to pass a resolution with the QR code, Chairman Chapman would have to make a decision or recommendation to this board as to how we want to address who we link it to. I do not believe that it's going to be, and maybe it is. I'm gonna be quiet there because I don't want to imply anything
Okay.
on how we link the QR code.
I was just
or where it
concerned by
links
the
to.
term relevant and feeling like we were going to censor what people went to.
No.
I think that's part of, but Robin, I do think that's part of the problem. I think that the content in the the content that the QR code links to, who is the decider of that information? When there is 100 and some million different sources or sources of information for Thomas Jefferson, who are we to link them to the, who is if we brought in a consultant or someone to tell us, who are they to tell people what sources to read? So just my humble opinion.
And Darrell, as you know, my first thoughts were that the QR code was not a good idea. The more I think about it, my question is, what real difference does it make? I'm not too sure it'd be a mistake either way. In fact, as we've had this discussion and during the day, I've wondered, is this a resolution that we really need to address today? Or would we want to continue to think about it and look at it at our next meeting?
To what benefit?
I think we have to give thought to messaging and the message we're going to send. And I think if we, not that we're rushing through it, although we've only seen the final version for a period of 24 hours, so it's not like.
No, you haven't seen the final version yet.
We haven't even seen the final version. That's right. We haven't even seen the final version. So I remember a meeting a few months ago where we adopted a resolution with blanks that we came to regret. So I don't know that there's any real hurry. I mean, if somebody wants to make a motion to adopt the resolution, I'll certainly vote on it. But I think there's an important messaging aspect here to lots of people who care about this. Quite frankly, probably care about it more than we do. And I think that's important to me.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
I'm a little worried about putting it, that we just keep kicking the can down the road.
I don't
agree.
know that we're kicking it down the road. I think this is the first meeting it's been on the agenda, right?
I may have a different perspective because I feel like I lived through the task force. So to me, this has been something I've talked about
Yeah,
for
yeah.
maybe a longer time than maybe other people have.
Yeah,
I may
because
lose sight of that.
we haven't had the task force report
Right.
that long.
Right, true enough.
We've had the task force report
April?
since January.
Oh, like, you know, that might be right.
It's been since January. Todd?
And I don't mind voting on it today,
Okay.
once we figure out what we're voting on.
I think the issue is very narrow, whether we have the QR code. I think everyone seems to be in agreement on everything else. The wayward sign doesn't sound like that we have any issues there, just a QR code. And so,
Well, right now, there's no issue before us, so I guess someone needs to make a motion.
but we had Todd still had a comment, yeah.
I have 2 graduate degrees from the University of Virginia. I've sat on more benches with a bust of Thomas Jefferson than I can remember. And frankly, I've heard, read books and books. It's kind of almost like a quasi-religion there. And if we start to get into who this man was, one of the things that I most disagree with Jefferson on was his view of the deity. Are we gonna put both sides of that? I mean, he had some strange views on religion, strange to me. He had how far are we gonna go? Are we only going to contextualize in one context? Are we gonna try to contextualize the man, which I think gets back to, like all men, there are a lot of things about him not to be admired, in my opinion. That's my opinion. And this is supposed to be an institution of higher learning where our students and our faculty are capable of making decisions and exploring these things. And I don't know that we need to give them a roadmap or an officially sanctioned view, a university sanctioned view of what they need to read or consider or think about. So, I guess I would be opposed to anything like that.
And this is, as Robin said, and she's probably heard me say this a million times, and Daryl, this is a hard issue for me. And the reason that it's hard for me is because I don't believe in erasing history. I like how she put it, that, if you're a founding father of this country, you had good sides, you had bad sides. My fundamental problem with this whole resolution issue, and that's why I could vote for something that said, no, we're not accepting this, because that wasn't the charge. The charge, as I read it, and I went back and read it again before this meeting, the charge was, how do you contextualize Thomas Jefferson and his relationship to the University of Missouri? Why is that statue on our campus? Was the question. This report lost sight of that. And this report, at least from my understanding, because you're right, there's so many scholarly articles about his life. But as a former summer welcome leader, as a former tour team member, my understanding was that he was on this campus because of the Louisiana Purchase. And that if we were going to contextualize him, we were going to contextualize him based on what he did and why he's on this campus. Virginia, not my problem. I understand that they're doing a bunch of things because he had much more of a relationship there because he's founding it. He did not found the University of Missouri. He did not come to this campus and build one building. I mean, if you want to talk about indigenous people, if you want to talk about slaves, I'm all up for that discussion. But that wasn't the question that we charged that task force with, and it bothered me the whole time, and it bothers me now, because you're contextualizing him for what he did based on this campus. And so when you go so far afield from what you were asked to do, I have a problem with that. And that's why I wanted to have that task force discussion, because I'm like, are we charging these task force to do a specific thing and then provide us information on it? Or are we saying, well, once you get there, do whatever you want? And then we're now painted in a corner to debating things that I will grant you they have merit, and I will grant you that if we want to have that discussion, I have a completely different opinion. But that's not what we asked them to do, and that's why I have a problem with it.
Okay. So we are awaiting a motion for the resolution.
Before a motion is made, may I ask the curators if they would like to see a copy of an alternative resolution that does deal with the QR code? If they are, I would be more than happy to present that. If they're not interested in seeing it, I would be more than happy to move forward with where we are.
And you can answer however you see fit. Don't take this as any additional persuasion by me. But I kind of started where you did, Mike, Curator Williams, that we didn't ask whether or not to contextualize. We asked how. And I feel like, to some degree, we don't have to agree with the recommendation, but it feels as though we asked for advice on how to contextualize the statue, why it's on our campus, which can go in many different directions. So that was kind of where I started, but obviously it's up to the board, and I can't disagree with anything you're saying, that it would be very difficult to contextualize him, but I think I think that's all I'll say.
Yeah, see, so you have the same pause as I do, and I'm like, are you asking me about his whole life, or are you asking me about Columbia, Missouri? And so I don't know that the resolution needs to be, if we're not adopting the report, I don't know that we need a separate resolution. I think, but I'm all on board with the resolution as written, and so if you call the question, I will vote. I have this war going on with myself.
Curator Williams, if we were to put a QR code, we could restrict the contextualization to why he is on this campus and answer that question. Seriously, we could pick If the task force was charged with why is Thomas Jefferson on this campus, we can use a QR code to answer that question.
Yeah, I
And
agree
leave,
with
and then
that.
leave all the other aspects of Thomas Jefferson.
I think but there was a plaque already that states that. It's on the ground, which is, I think, part of the problem. People don't see it underneath that bench. But it explains that the Jefferson Club gave that statue. Now, I'd have to go back and find that picture explains how fully, but I thought it was pretty detailed. Curator Williams, do you remember?
Yes, I'm trying to think of who sent it, and I can pull it
Tracy?
up.
John Anderson.
Well, Greg, let me ask you, if we do what you suggest, restrict the QR code to something that of necessity is going to be more favorable to Jefferson than the other, are we creating a problem we really don't need?
Well, one of the concerns, you say more favorable, there's absolutely no question that Thomas Jefferson was responsible for the Louisiana Purchase. There's absolutely no question, if not for Thomas Jefferson, the University of Missouri, as we know it today, probably would not be here because we may or may not be part of the United States.
No,
Yeah.
that's
Here's where I'm going to.
That misses my whole point.
Well, my point I'm trying to make of this is that it's not, there are some people who believe the Louisiana Purchase as to be horrible to the American Indians and that we did not treat them fairly under the treaties for which we acquired this ground with this university is setting on. So to me, as to why is Thomas Jefferson on the statue, because he was part of the university, the Louisiana Purchase and responsible for it, is beginning of why we're here. And that whole context of how we ended up with the ground becomes part of it. And I would tell you that some people would not think that was very complimentary of him. And other people would say, yeah, you've told the story that we want told relative to how the university acquired the ground. So it's not all just going to be completely complimentary, I wouldn't think.
And if I can read to you what the current plaque says, I think this provides some context. This bronze sculpture and garden were given to the University of Missouri, Columbia, by the trustees of the Jefferson Club to recognize the university's unique connection with Thomas Jefferson. MU is the first land-grant university in the Louisiana Purchase territory, and the design of the Francis Quadrangle is modeled after the plan first used by Jefferson at the University of Virginia.
Sounds like any further contextualization may be redundant based on the plaque. This connection to Missouri is in the plaque. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Maybe we need to not have it on the ground where people could see it. Maybe we need to relocate the plaque where you can see it. It's in the mulch bed.
You found it online, though, Michael.
No, I sent it to him from a picture.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was a picture that we were sent on the task
Task
force.
force.
So I guess the question is, do we have a motion to accept the to put the resolution up for a vote, or do we have a motion or a request to see a resolution with the QR code? I will go ahead, Greg.
I think it's important for the board to at least read an alternative before they make a decision.
Okay, then let's get the alternative circulated. Valerie? Thank you.
I'll just offer my own opinion that I think the contextualization for why he's here is more than the Louisiana Purchase, but I don't think he'd be here if we weren't also celebrating his role as a founding father. So,
And an influencer of higher education in our country.
yeah. There's more than just the Louisiana Purchase, at least from my perspective, and I think you can interpret the charge of the task force in many different ways. And I think the issue is that people are struggling with not taking a biased view of the contextualization. To me, the issue is to contextualize or not to contextualize. That is the question.
So has everyone had an opportunity to take a look at the resolution with the QR code language, the one that's up on the screen? Any thoughts on this one versus the other resolution?
Again, Mr. Chairman, when I started, I said I could easily be persuaded to support one with a QR code. After listening to all the members of the board and thinking about what have I experienced the last year, it's my first year on the board and everything, my recommendation to this distinguished body is to accept the resolution with the QR code on it.
And the contextualization contained within the QR code, I think that's the question that we must.
Then how you contextualize within the QR code will be determined through the power of your office as we finalize the best source to do that through.
And it will be within the context of the original charge of the task force.
I believe, Mr. Chairman, that still lays within your purview. The this resolution does not say that. If in the best interest and the judgment for this university that you decide or we decide, or in consultation with administration, that we restrict it just to the university, to the purchase, the Louisiana Purchase and the house there, or we expand it or allow it to his entire life. I think those are some of the issues that you and I have had a lot of conversation about recently as to what we should do. And I specifically left it open so that we had the room to do what is right for the citizens of this state.
Understood. So is that a motion? You're making a motion to approve the resolution containing the QR code as you just stated. Correct, Greg?
Mr. Chairman, I do move that the Board of Curators adopts the resolution with the QR code that's currently on the big screen.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Oh. We have Molly. Oh, Mo, I'm sorry. Mo, what is your
Mr.
question?
Chairman, I just want to make a quick comment that whatever decision is made will have impact beyond just this campus. Because we have buildings named Thomas Jefferson, there are other places, and I just wanted to make that comment that whatever decision is made here will not be limited to just this campus.
You are correct, Mo. We have Jefferson City, so we got big things.
So I have a
Yes,
question
Go ahead,
also.
Jeff. Go ahead.
So this says QR code to allow further exploration of the details of all facets of Thomas Jefferson's life. What about the next QR code? You know, for the next statue, the next building, the next textbook, the next, where does that fall? Who handles that? Has there been any thought to that?
I'll ask the people that are in favor.
I just wonder if anybody's thought about that. Where are we going with this? And is this?
I think we maybe ask questions about the next monument or the next naming of a building, but I don't think the curators will make any decisions, or we probably delegate authority in the choosing of textbooks. I think the question is whether you want to contextualize or not contextualize. If we can go around the horn, I think it's a majority issue, and nobody's trying to win this. There isn't a win.
Moon had a comment.
So with regards to textbooks, with regards to material and the area of research that our faculty members pursue, that ability to use academic freedom to choose the material by experts is a critical foundation of this university. So I just want to make that comment.
Okay.
But I don't think that's what you were asking. Was it? Yeah, okay.
We have
Yeah,
a
and if the
motion.
question is, we probably won't acquire another Thomas Jefferson statue. Or,
But we have the Jefferson Club. Do they need to have a statement in their solicitation materials?
If I'm not, I think Jefferson Club has already made a statement, because,
Bill Roundtree.
yeah, I couldn't think of his name. Mr. Roundtree, I think they already have an official statement from the Jefferson Club.
but this is about the curator's authority over statues and monuments, right?
Yeah, statues, monuments, buildings.
QR codes linking to information regarding the same.
Yeah, so are we going to contextualize, or are we not going to contextualize?
Well, we have a motion and a second.
Mr. Chairman, while we're in discussion, we've heard from one chancellor on the issue. I'd defer to you, but I wonder if either of the other two chancellors present would have any comment.
Marcy, I always appreciate your wisdom. Please, Mo, please speak up. Kristen? We heard from Mo Mali, I'm sorry.
That's all right. We don't have any references to Jefferson, as far as I know, on a campus, but I think Chancellor Degani brings up a good point. As Curator Lehman also said, what's the next step after this? Because there may be other people, other names, other individuals, and so we need to keep that in mind as we make a decision on this.
Okay.
I'm in agreement with that, and with regards to being an educational institution, I think it's always our purview to educate, whether these are hard things to educate, and obviously, right now, this is a very hard topic. But I think we shouldn't shy away from the education side of our job, because frankly, that's the foundation of what we do here. And I would want, in fact, right now I'm writing a note about, we have a Thomas Jefferson Library. And I'm writing a note about how then we are going to try and move forward to make sure that we are educating our students and our population. And what better place to do that than with that foundation of a library.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Jeff, did you have something? Okay. All right. Then we must vote. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Okay. Any abstentions? Okay, Cindy, since we have some opposition, we are going to do a roll call.
Curator Burnsick,
Yes?
Curator Chapman,
No.
Curator Graham, Curator Graham, yes,
Yes.
Curator Graves,
No.
Curator Hobrock,
Yes.
Curator Lehman,
No.
Curator Winokur,
No.
Curator Williams.
Seriously, I'm the last vote. So that conflict continues, but I will vote yes.
Yes?
Yes.
It's like a Supreme Court decision.
So yes, the vote is 4 in favor and 4 opposed.
So it did not pass.
Did not pass.
Okay. Would someone entertain a motion on the other resolution? I guess we'd be in the same spot. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Would someone entertain would someone make a motion for the first resolution? I will make a motion to adopt Resolution 1 without the QR code. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
We have a motion and a second. Do we have any further discussion? Okay, let's vote.
Can you clarify what we're voting on?
The first resolution without.
Oh, so
the QR
just the resolution, no QR code?
No, that one that had.
Denying the task force recommendation in full.
Yes. Okay, we have a motion, we have a second. Further discussion? Anyone?
Call for the question.
Okay, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Okay, any abstentions? Cindy, please call the roll.
Curator Burnsick,
No.
Curator Chapman,
Yes.
Curator Graham,
Yes.
Curator Graves,
Yes.
Curator Hobrock,
Yes.
Curator Lehman,
Yes.
Curator Winokur,
Yes.
Curator Williams.
Yes.
We have 7 votes in favor, 1 opposed.
Okay, motion passes. Okay, thank you, everyone, for that discussion. I know this was a tough decision, and Julia, I really appreciate you stepping forward.
This was a lot of fun.
I really appreciate it. All right, so let's move on to our next action item, the MU History Committee proposal. All right, Christine, we'll do this again, round 2.
Chair Chapman, I'm in place this time. Good. As a summary of the MU History Committee, it was formed in the fall of 2018 at the request of former Chancellor Alexander Cartwright, based on a resolution that came from Faculty Council to consider ways to recognize slave labor and potentially other groups that contributed to the establishment and early operations of the university. And I will say, over the course of the years since 2018, the membership and the leadership have changed quite a bit. Some cycled off, some came in, but roughly we had over 50 to 75 faculty, staff, students, administrators, and historians on the committee or on the task force at one time or another before the proposal was submitted last fall. The group's suggestions featured a marked history walk that would include a starting plaque to recognize the role of enslaved people during the time of the university's origins. The walk then proceeds to provide markers for Black history trailblazers. The group also suggested refurbishing an existing and unnamed fountain as a place of reflection. Overall, the committee really looked at 3 areas: to pursue scholarship, to advance research, provide educational opportunities and programming to the community, and lastly, as I said, to recognize the contributions of the enslaved and other pioneers that had not been recognized. Chair Chapman, that concludes my brief statement.
Okay, thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you.
Once again, Greg, Curator Hobrock, I'd like you to, are we going to put our resolution?
Yes.
Go ahead, Greg.
Mr. Chairman, as you all know, I have a resolution prepared relative to the history walk. I was charged with getting stuff put together. And I think they're passing it out to everybody, and I'm assuming they will put it up on the screen for all to see. My thoughts relative to the history walk, the charges well, first I want to acknowledge that the role of enslaved peoples in the foundation of this university, and their original charge was to memorialize that. The problem is this proposal just grossly exceeded the original charge and went way astray. And I graduated from this university, and what I learned through this whole process was I did not know that enslaved people were used as janitors in this facilities, and I did not really give much thought to the fact that enslaved people contribute to the economic benefit of those that offered money to this campus to get started. And I believe that we should honor the enslaved peoples that were part of the founding of this university. But I believe this proposal in itself and the way they have done this does not do that, and it far exceeds what they originally charged with. Furthermore, there were 15 people, I think, listed, and 8 or 9 of the people that they wanted to honor are already honored on this campus through buildings and everything else. And I fundamentally believe their concept of a unity fountain or renaming a fountain or using the fountain that currently exists on this place as a place to reflect about those people, both enslaved and non-enslaved, that contributed to the founding of this university. And it leaves open the possibility of some artwork or some other things, but that could later be added if those items were approved individually. So my resolution basically is to, as it reads, is to create the unity, what we would call the unity fountain, as a place for people to think about all these issues and
and to contemplate the founding of this university and those people that contributed to it.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I do not have a competing resolution that I would offer later. Therefore, I move that it be adopted.
Okay.
I'll second that.
We have a motion, and we have a second. Do we have any further discussion or comments?
Call for the question.
Okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Wait, I do have a question. I'm sorry. I'm just reading the resolution.
Yes, Julia?
Is the resolution that we're going to have a fountain of unity, not that it will be a fountain to honor the enslaved people? Or it reads to say that it is a place of reflection to appreciate all people, I think.
Yes, all people who contributed to the foundation of this university, which could be a place for them to honor the enslaved people, the indigenous people, and there's other people whose names may not be known, or names who are known, who contributed to this. And conceptually, it's an opportunity for, I will use, if somebody wanted to add some artwork to honor the enslaved people, I'm sure that that could be considered at the Unity Fountain to help in our understanding and reflection of their contributions. But so would the opportunity for others who feel that somebody is not recognized who contributed to this campus and this university to also be represented there.
Okay, so the Unity Fountain is not to acknowledge the role of enslaved people, it's to acknowledge anybody who helped build the university.
Including enslaved people, yes.
Including but not limited to enslaved people.
Correct.
Okay, any further questions or discussions? Okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay?
Nay.
Okay, Cindy, please, any abstentions? Okay, Cindy, please call the roll.
Curator Burnsick,
Nay.
Curator Chapman,
Yes.
Curator Graham,
Yes.
Curator Graves,
Yes.
Curator Hobrock,
Yes.
Curator Lehman,
Yes.
Curator Winokur,
Yes.
Curator Williams.
No.
You have 6 votes in favor, 2 opposed.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Once again, another tough decision. We appreciate all of our curators, even those that disagree with us on certain issues. I want to make that clear. Okay? So moving forward, we're now to the good and welfare of the board. Are there any items for the good and welfare of the board? Hearing none?
Yeah, Chairman, Darrell, yeah, I would like to, in the public meeting, say something, and I'll do it as quickly as I can, but I'm kind of the senior man. I came on in December on the board, December of 2015, and as all of us know, shortly after that, there was a homecoming parade, and all of a sudden, our university, the campus we're on today, was in not just national media, but it was in international media, and it was such a tough time. And we dealt with so many challenges during that period of time, and shortly after that, Dr. Choi came on board, and things have improved since then. But, so I've been to a lot of board meetings, and I've got to say that I'm as proud of our board today as I've ever been. Julia, and Mike, Jeff, and Greg, and Robin, and Todd, each one of you individually and collectively, I've never been prouder of our board. We did today what a board is supposed to do. And immensely thankful and proud.
Well, that means a lot coming from you, Curator Graham, for sure. So thank you for that. Any other words of wisdom for the good and welfare of the board? Okay, this concludes the public session for today's meeting. Again, the board thanks everyone for their reports. President Choi and I will be available during the press conference, which will be held in a few minutes. The board will move into executive session at 2:45. Is that accurate, Cindy?
No way.
Do you really think you're going to get out of that?
We'll say approximately 2:45.
Approximately.
I'll drive home and we can do it virtual.
All right.